Good evening and welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Second 960. I wanted to chat for a little bit about what I think is going to happen with the economy coming out of COVID-19. And bottom line, I don't think we're going to come out of COVID-19 for a while. I've had the privilege of interviewing a whole bunch of people working on vaccines, a whole bunch of people working on PPE, some people that are economists, some healthcare workers, some physicians, etc. And my assessment is that this is going to be a long fight. And I think a lot of you know that, but I worry that too many people are thinking that the fight's over and are springing back into regular life. And I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think it's going to be a long fight that we have to be very vigilant about until such time as we actually get a vaccine. And more importantly, actually, until probably more than 50% of the people in the population take the vaccine, because we have to have herd immunity that most people think is in the 60 to 70% range. And with anti-vaxxers and with a whole bunch of people that are all about freedom of choice, I worry that it's going to take a long time to actually get enough people to take the vaccine such that we actually end up having the immunity in the community that we need. Though, frankly, even if we have 40 or 50% of the people taking it, that'll slow down, hopefully, the spread. Anyway, I want to take you through a couple of graphs to try to explain this conclusion that I've reached, if I could. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to share a couple of screens with you and try to explain what my concerns are. So first of all, what I want to do is I want to talk through the sort of the shapes of the economic recovery. The first is to take you back through history and explain a couple of different shapes. The first is the V-shaped recovery, and you saw this coming out of a recession in the mid-1950s, where there was a huge amount of pent-up demand, and the recovery occurred almost right away. That's in the top left. On the top right is what most people think of as a U-shaped recovery, which would have been the recession in the mid-1970s. It just took a long time for you to come out of the recession. There was a couple of starts and stops as people tried to come out of the recession, as the economies tried to come out of the recession. But it took, as you can see here, a good 2.5, 3 years before the recession was over. On the bottom left is the W recession. A lot of people are worried that if we have a second wave to hit us in the fall of 2020 or even in the winter of 2021, spring of 2021, which would be comparable to what happened in the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, that we could have this W recession, that we have this kickback in the summer and fall of this year, but then with renewed closures, that we end up going back down into recession before we ultimately come back out maybe 18 months from now. In this situation, you can see that it was a good 2 years before such time as the economy came out, and this is from the early 1980s. And I remember this well because this is when I graduated university, and it took a long time for people to get good full-time jobs that were graduating from university. It was a tough situation. Interest rates were high. And that contributed to the problem. And then probably one of the most concerning is the bottom right, which is the L-shaped recovery, which is credited mostly to Japan, where Japan had this big boom. And I was in my graduate degree in 1988, and one of our major final exams was on how Japan was taking over the world. And if you remember back to the late 1980s, people thought that Japan would take over the world, where I think a couple of blocks of land in downtown Tokyo was equal to all of Manhattan in value. But then the bubble burst, and you can see what ended up happening with unbelievably low growth or no growth for a long period of time. And so it was the L-shaped recovery, even though they brought interest rates down to next to nothing, flooded the market with liquidity. They just couldn't get it out of recession. And so you take a look at what's happened today, and this is some economics that I'm going to share with you. We have had a dip, and we've had a recovery, but the recovery has been very different in different places of the world. And clearly where people got the public health crisis under control, we had more of a recovery than in the United States, where, as everyone knows, the public health response has not been nearly as attractive. And then some people, actually a lot of people, are talking about the Nike swoosh, or what Canadians would typically refer to as the hockey stick, where, yeah, you get a decline, but then frankly, the swoosh back in ends up being even more successful, and you're better off longer term than you were before. And people are talking about this being, pent-up demand, PPE, new manufacturing, onshoring, a whole bunch of reasons why the economy could actually be better later on. And some people are suggesting that might actually be happening in Europe right now, but I don't agree. And you take a look at what's ended up happening with a bunch of the economies and projections for the economies, particularly in the United States, which drives so much of the world economy. Yes, there's been a decline. Yes, there's been somewhat of recovery as the economies have opened up, but it's really been fits and starts. And so therefore, I think actually, regrettably, it might end up being what some people have called this reverse square root recovery, where you have this dip and then you have a recovery, but the recovery is never as good as you started out from being. And if you take a look at just one indication, which I think is probably a pretty good indication, U.S. small business employees. Lots of bragging by President Donald Trump about increases in employment, and there has been increases in employment, but we're not back to where we could and should be. And so therefore, I think that the key here is that, yes, there is going to be unquestionably some recovery as restrictions are lifted, but I believe that we're going to be very under slow growth till a long period of time. It could easily shift back negatively as economies shut down again. And it really depends on government action. And we've had good government action in Canada and in some places in Europe, but we've had almost no national government action and very different government action in different states in the United States. And it really does depend on long-term government policy, public healthcare policy, and those different economic fiscal strategies that are taking. So when you take a look at the different kinds of recoveries that we could have, 73% of economists currently are suggesting that it's this reverse square root, that the recovery is going to be there, but it's going to be less than we were initially. And it's going to cause, if not permanent damage, at least long-term damage to the economies. And so therefore, I think the key here is that government action is key, vigilance is key, and we all know what those are. They are social distancing, which I think really should be physical distancing, not social distancing, because we need to be socially close to people, but doing that from 6 feet away and or via electronic means. It's wearing masks whenever you're in interior space. It is washing your hands and sneezing into your elbows and all these different things that we've learned. And it's isolating, in shelter in place, frankly, people that are vulnerable. And the people that are vulnerable are 20% of the population, maybe 30% of the population, and they are 20 times more likely to be hospitalized as anyone else. It's a 20-to-1 ratio for those that are vulnerable versus the rest of the population. And if you think about that risk reward or that risk rating of 20-to-1 more likely to be hospitalized, we owe those people that are vulnerable our protection. And we should make sheltering in place far more easier so they can stay at home and they don't have to see people, that food can be brought to them, that their needs for income can be met, and that they just don't need to get out there. Because number one, if they get out there, they're going to get very sick. Number two, they're going to probably 80% of them that get on ventilators pass away. And number three, they're going to use up a whole bunch of ICU space that's going to be needed for everyone else. And so we've got to do the right thing for our vulnerable populations, which are primarily people that are above the age of 70, 75, and for sure 80. And also for those that have got underlying health conditions, diabetes, overweight, autoimmune diseases, etc. And so what's the message that I'm trying to make? The message that I'm trying to make is, this is not over yet. It's going to be a long fight. It's probably going to be a reverse kind of square root where for a long period of time, we don't come back to where we started. And there's a very risk of even that recovery having another falter into a W shape without that long-term shape ever coming back to where it was going to be if we have a second wave. And you know what? I'm not even sure that we've got a second wave in the United States right now. I think this is just the first wave hitting other states that didn't have the first wave. So we're still in the first wave coming through the United States, and it could go even farther as people are talking about it going from New York and California and Washington states to the southern United States, now coming back to California, and maybe into the Midwest eventually. And you know what? In that kind of a situation, it could easily come back to Canada. And remember, in Canada, the second wave killed more people than the first wave. So let's be vigilant. Let's not be overly optimistic. And let's protect our vulnerable. And let's all do the smart things by physically distancing, by wearing masks in public spaces, by not getting too eager and have 200 people come out to a party in your backyard, to keeping populations that get together to, under 50 for sure, but probably under 10. Anyway, everyone, stay healthy. Good night.